Namaskar. Continuing with the fifth module of this course on consumer behavior, we shall be proceeding with the concluding session of this particular module. As we discussed earlier, this module is titled Models of Consumers and Models of Consumer Behavior. It was essentially a module to be completed in 4 hours. The various topics are models of consumers, models of consumer behavior, the general models, the specific models, and the basic models. In the previous sessions, we have discussed the general models, and we have also discussed the basic models, and today we shall be doing the specific models. We have already discussed specific models 1 and 2 in the previous session, where we spoke about Nicosia's flowchart model, and we spoke about the Howard and Shate model of consumer decision making. Today we will proceed with 2 more models, one titled the Bettmans information processing model, and the second is the EKB model, which was later modified as the EBM model. We should first be discussing the EKB model, and then we shall be moving on to discuss the Bettmans model. Now, as we all know, consumer models basically help us understand the varying approaches, the varying perspectives and orientations with which consumers approach the marketplace and enter into the decision making process. They basically refer to how the various orientations have an impact on the buying decision process and overall buying behavior. General models and specific models have been discussed, have been proposed. The previous sessions have dealt with the general models and the specific models. Today, the rest of the 2 specific models will be dealt in this session. And as I just said, we will speak about the Engel, Collett and Blackwell model of consumer behavior, and this was later modified and proposed as the Engel, Collett and Miniard model of consumer behavior. We will also be following it up with the next model, which is Bettmans information processing model of consumer behavior. Now, let us first start with the EBM or the EKB model. EKB is Engel, Blackwell and Collett, and the EBM is the Engel, Blackwell and Miniard model of consumer behavior. So, now this particular model, which is the EKB model, was also referred to as the EBM later on, was proposed to organize the growing body of research and the growing body of consumer behavior, knowledge pertaining to consumer behavior. As it was a very comprehensive model which was proposed initially in the 1960s. To be precise, it was the year 1968 where EKB proposed this model, where they showed or depicted the various components of which impact consumer decision making, and they illustrated the relationships or the interdependence and interactions between these variables. The model was tested, validated and studied across many product categories, many product purchase situations. It went through many revisions and modifications, where the emphasis was on explaining the relationship between the various components and the subcomponents and of consumer decision making. And finally, the model was proposed, which came to be known as the EBM or the Engel, Blackwell and Miniard model. So, we will start with the Engel, Collett and Blackwell model, which was proposed in 1968, and then we will move on to see how it was adapted, how it was modified, how it was reframed and reintroduced as the Engel, Blackwell and Miniard model in the 80s. Okay, now coming to the EKB model, if you have a look at the model, it basically comprises 5 parts. We start with the information input, then we have information processing, we have the decision making stages or the decision process stages, we have the decision process variables, which actually get broken up into product brand evaluations and general motivating influences, and then finally we have the external and influences in the form of internalized environmental influences. So, if you see the model, there are 5 parts: the information input, the information processing, the decision process stage, the decision process variables, and the external influences. To start with, let us first discuss information input. Now, the information input includes all the different kinds of stimuli that a consumer is exposed to, and such a stimuli triggers a kind of behavior. So, any and all of the stimuli that a consumer is exposed to and which triggers some kind of a behavior actually constitutes what we call information input. We have the various stimuli which could be in the form of the coming from the it could be in the form of masses or personal or general marketer dominated. So, we have these various kinds of stimuli where we generally focus on the stimuli which is presented by the marketer. The consumer is exposed to marketing efforts in the form of advertising, publicity, personal selling, demonstrations, or even store display, or even the point of purchase stimuli. Apart from this marketing stimuli which he is exposed to, the consumer is also exposed to other kind of stimuli in the form of which actually come from non-marketing sources, and the non-marketing sources here could mean the family, the friends, the peers. It is noteworthy here to mention that because the stimuli comes in various sources, comes from various sources and in many forms, both marketing dominated or non-marketing, the various stimuli compete for the customer's attention. So, basically the customer is attentive to some of these stimuli which basically we will see pertain to his need or his motivation pattern or other psychographic components. These stimuli provide information to the consumer and they trigger off the decision making process. So, information input basically comes in the form of stimuli, both marketing and non-marketing, and this stimuli triggers a kind of the process in the minds of the consumer which is related to the purchase decision. So, it actually triggers off the decision making process. The second input in the model if you see is the second construct in the model if you see is information processing. Stimuli received in the first stage provides information, and in this particular stage the information which is received is processed into a meaningful whole. The stage comprises a consumer's exposure, attention, and reception of information. So, the stimuli basically whether from marketing sources or non-marketing sources is also acts as an information cue to which the consumer is exposed to. This exposure leads to some form of an attention in the minds of the consumer or in the part of the consumer, and he receives information. So, there is attention and reception of information which actually goes into his active memory set. The consumer is exposed to stimuli and the accompanying information cues. The attention actually determines which of the stimuli would receive further consideration. After this, the consumer interprets the information cue, finds out more if it is required, and receptivity or reception takes place. He first accepts it in his short term memory and then he retains it finally by transferring the input to his long term memory for further retrieval and usage. So, the cues that he is exposed to, depending upon the relevance, depending upon the importance, will basically be set up for further consideration. He would lay attention to it. Thereafter, there would be a receptivity in case he finds the information cue to be inadequate and insufficient. He searches out for more information. Reception takes place, which finally he stores in his short term memory, and later on he retains it and transfers it to his long term memory for further retrieval and usage. Then we move to the third construct or the third variable, the EKB model, which is the decision process stage. Now, this decision process stage comprises 5 stages, where we start with a problem recognition, a search, alternative evaluation, the choice, and the outcomes. So, it is at any time of the information processing stage, whether it is exposure or attention or reception, at any of these stages, depending upon the product or service category, depending upon the consumer and his personality type and his psychographic characteristics, also depending upon the situation, purchase situation, or the time available in hand, the consumer could enter into this stage at any of these stages, whether it is at exposure or at attention or at perception. At any of these information processing stages, the consumer could enter into the decision process stage. This would, as I repeat, this would depend upon the product or service category in question, the person himself, and the purchase situation. So, at any of the stages or at any of the time of information processing, the consumer could enter into the decision process stage. The process starts with the usual problem recognition, which, depending upon the importance of the purchase, will actually lead to a search for information. The search for information here will mean information about the product category or about the various brands. The consumer will basically rely on internal sources based on his memory. If such sources seem insufficient, he could go in for some search for information, and this search activity could also be impacted by certain kinds of environmental forces. So, there is a problem which leads to a search for information about the product category and about the brands. The information search relies basically on internal sources, which is primarily one's memory. In case these sources seem insufficient and inadequate, he searches for external sources, or he looks around for more information, and he talks to his friends, peers, colleagues, or may refer to some kinds of newspapers or magazines or journals or special interest magazines, or even talk to the salesperson or the dealer and look to websites or other sources of information. And this search for information will also be impacted by environmental influences. After he has searched for information, we basically come to evaluating the alternatives. During the evaluation stage, the consumer's beliefs lead to formation of attitudes, and these attitudes have an impact on purchase intention. So, if you see here, the search for information is followed by evaluation of alternatives. Consumers' predispositions or beliefs or values will have an impact on attitude formation, and these attitudes will further lead to a purchase intention on the part of the consumer. This leads to the fourth stage, which is, and the fifth stage, which is the choice and purchase, which majorly gets impacted by individual differences. Could be motives, could be personality, could be lifestyle, could be other psychographic components. It also gets affected by normative compliance, and normative compliance here meaning compliance to social norms and social approval, and also gets impacted by anticipated and unanticipated circumstances. So, the choice and the purchase is basically impacted by a person's individual differences in terms of his motives, personality, lifestyle, psychographics, also in terms of the normative compliance and both anticipated and unanticipated circumstances. So, these you have the product and brand evaluation impacting the search process and the choice. Similarly, you have the general motivating influences which impact the product choice and also the purchase outcome. Finally, there is the purchase outcome, which may be positive or negative, and it manifests itself in the form of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Whatever be the outcome, whether satisfaction or dissatisfaction, it is going to lead to as a feedback on the input or the information input again. Now, this outcome could also be in the form of a dissonance or an uncertainty or an anxiety or a feeling of tension and anxiety which a consumer may face post purchase. So, both satisfaction and dissonance is going to have an impact later on the information on the purchase process in the next cycle. For example, satisfaction will have an impact and gets stored as an experience into one's memory. Similarly, dissonance or anxiety or tension will have an impact on further search or further search for information to basically reassure himself or of himself that he's made the right choice. In any case, the outcome acts as a feedback on the input and impacts the entire purchase cycle again. So, we have the various environmental influences, the individual influences and the social influences which directly or indirectly influence each of the stages of the decision process. If you see the environmental influences in the form of culture or values or anticipated, unanticipated influences. Similarly, individual influences in the form of psychographic influences and social influences in the form of normative compliance will have an impact directly or indirectly on the purchase process. Now, these influences could actually take form of general motivating influences and internalized environmental influences. Now, EKB proposed, Engel, Collat and Blackwell actually proposed that it's not always necessary for a consumer to go through all of these stages of the buying process. It would actually depend a lot upon the whether the problem is an extensive problem solving or it is a routinized purchase. So, it's not absolutely essential for a consumer to go through all these 5 stages of the decision making process. It will actually depend upon the product or service category in question, whether it's a high involvement purchase or a low involvement purchase, whether it is a first time purchase or it is a routinized purchase, whether the level of perceived risk is high or low. In other words, what we are talking of, whether it is extensive problem solving or a limited problem solving. Now, let's come next to the decision process variables. Now, the decision process variables basically speak, the model actually proposes certain individual influences that affect the decision making process. These decision process variables or individual characteristics include constructs like demographics, motives, beliefs, attitudes, personality, values, lifestyle, normative compliance, etc. And then we have finally the external influences which takes into account social and situational influences that affect the decision making process. Social influences include cultural values and norms, reference groups, families and other normative influences, and the situational factors actually include both anticipated and unanticipated or expected and unexpected circumstances and purchase situations. Now, if you look at the working relationship between the components and the model, the decision process comprises 5 stages: need recognition or problem recognition to outcome. The outcome in the form of satisfaction or dissatisfaction acts as an input in the next cycle of similar purchase. Each of the components is directly or indirectly impacted by environmental influences, individual influences and social influences. Now, if looking beyond, let us now come to the assessment of the model. The model basically incorporates many of the variables, many of the constructs that impact consumer decision making. In fact, EKB have put forth and introduced a very comprehensive model trying to take into account the various constructs that actually have work or they actually impact the and interplay or the interrelation between these constitutes or these components in fact impacts consumer decision making in a very deep or a very in a very strong way. It basically explains the interrelationships between the various stages of the decision making process, like for example talking about various variables like relationship between belief, attitude and intention. So it clearly shows very thoroughly, it explains, very comprehensively explains the relationship between the various constructs, the relationship between the various components, like something to do with belief to attitude to intention, or even put forth evaluative criteria leading to an intention, leading to an evaluative criteria leading to a belief, leading to in attitude, and finally leading to a purchase intention. It defines very nicely the various constructs, the various relationship between the various constructs, and it also is something which the model is very versatile. It has been tested through many product and service categories, through many purchase situations, and so it's extremely versatile, and it proves its validity and its reliability. It is in a form, it is a very robust model which tries to explain the various components in the form of information output, information processing, decision process, product brand evaluations, general motivating influences, and internalized environmental influences. In a manner, as a model, it depicts the relationships between the various constructs in a very meaningful manner, and provides a lot of insight into what happens in the consumer decision making process. It's an extremely versatile model which has been tested across various product and service categories, various purchase situations, and it is a model which has been studied very thoroughly. However, the model also suffers from certain limitations. The model fails to explain as to how each of these influences consumer decision. In the manner, it does not measure the magnitude or the intensity of relationship between each of these variables. Also, there are too many variables. Many researchers have pointed out that there are too many variables, and these have not been very clearly defined. While on the other hand, some researchers have appreciated the fact that the model has many variables, and EKB deal with each of these very justifiably, and they explain consumer decision making in a very comprehensive manner. But then there is another school of thought which says that there are too many variables, making the model very complex. Many of these variables have not been defined, they are vague, and although the model has been tested across product and service categories and across purchase situations, the validity of the model is actually questionable. It is debatable. The model was actually revised in the 1980s, and it was reintroduced and reproposed as the EBM model in 1986. So let us see the model here. The model here now comprises 4 sections, and if you see the variables and the working relationships is similar, but it has been slightly modified. So if you look here, there are 4 variables which again similar to the EKB. We have the information input, we have the information processing. Now the information processing, instead of just being a very simple exposure, attention and retention, we have 2 more constructs here in the form of comprehension and perception, and in the form of yielding and acceptance. Then we have the third constituent of the model, which is decision process, which again similar to the EKB model, and but again here, instead of the simple 5-staged process, we basically break it into a little more, we depict it a little differently, and finally we speak about the variables influencing the decision making process. Unlike the EKB, which spoke about 2 kinds of variables affecting decision making, that is the decision process variables and the external influences, and the decision making process being defined as the product brand evaluation and the general motivating influences. Instead of that, we just club together the various models influencing decision process in the form of individual constructs, individual characteristics, social influences and situational influences. So this model basically simplifies the earlier model, where in earlier model we had 5 components. Here we have 4 components. The difference lies again here. Information processing is explained little elaborately. The decision process is illustrated a little differently, and the various variables influencing the decision process, either in the form of general motivating factors or product evaluation, or in the form of other environmental influences. So all of those has been clubbed together and put under as variables influencing the decision making process. So if you look at the model, we start with the explanation here of the model, where the information received from the marketing and non-marketing stimuli acts as feeds into the information processing system. So whatever stimuli manifesting itself in information cues, either from the marketer or from non-marketing sources, in other words, either from under the control of the marketer or under the control of social forces. So both of these stimuli and information cues received from the stimuli feed into the information processing stage for a consumer. Now, as we just said, the stimuli could be both marketing or marketer related, or they could be socially related, coming from friends, peers, colleagues and other environmental forces. So the stimuli in the form of information cues feeds into the information processing, where we start with exposure. The consumer or the person is exposed to such stimuli. He gives attention to the stimuli or the information cues. This attention leads to some kind of an understanding, some kind of a comprehension and some kind of a perception in the consumer's mind. Finally, he yields to such information inputs, he accepts such information inputs, and this, or he may search for more information to basically go into this stage of acceptance of information. This information goes into his memory as retention, first into his short-term memory, then into his long-term memory, and for further retrieval and further usage. So the information section of the model comprises stages like exposure, attention, comprehension, acceptance and retention. So after passing through these stages, the information goes into the memory. Then this information is stored in the memory as an initial influence on the decision making process or on the problem recognition. So the next stage is decision making process, where we start with a problem recognition and there is a search for information. The consumer relies on his memory for the internal source of information. In case this is inadequate, he searches or he looks about for other external information. Based on this particular in search for information, he evaluates the various alternatives. Now, evaluation of alternatives based on knowledge, based on information either derived from external or internal sources, is also impacted by consumers' beliefs, attitudes and intention. So this evaluation basically is going to the evaluation is going to impact the beliefs, attitudes and intentions, and the beliefs, attitudes and intentions of the consumer are basically going to impact the purchase process or the purchase decision. So we start with the problem, we go in for search for information, we evaluate the different information on the basis of knowledge, on the basis of information gathered both from internal and external sources for information. This has an impact on consumer beliefs, on consumer attitude and consumer intention. So the belief is going to lead to formation of attitudes, and attitudes is going to lead to an intention to buy or not to buy. In case it is to buy, it leads to the fourth stage, which is purchase, and post purchase there is an outcome in the form of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. This dissatisfaction, in case there is a dissatisfaction, it is going to have an impact on it acts as a feedback for the future purchase cycle of similar products. In case of satisfaction, the beliefs are reinforced attitudes are strengthened and intention to repurchase becomes high. Um, Now, apart from the decision process, the fourth major component of the model is the various variables that will influence decision process at all of the various stages, whether it is problem recognition or search for information or evaluation of alternatives or purchase or outcome. The consumer is influenced by certain variables. These variables could be individual characteristics in the form of motives, values, lifestyle, personality. They could also be in the form of social influences like culture, reference groups and family, or they could also be in the form of social influences. So individual characteristics, social influences and situational characteristics affects each of the stages of the decision making process. So you have individual characteristics, you have social influences and you have situational influences. Individual characteristics will include motives, values, lifestyle and personality. All of this will impact the decision process. Social influences include culture, reference groups and families, which again is going to impact the decision making process, and apart from that there are situational influences which could be anticipated or unanticipated. Now, the model here focuses on decision process stages and starting with need recognition, search, pre-purchase evaluation, purchase, consumption, post-purchase alternative evaluation and also divestment. Now, divestment as a construct was additionally added as a modification over the previous EKB model, and divestment relates basically to issues of disposal, recycling or remarketing. Now, if you look at the model and if we go in for an assessment of the model, it is definitely an improvisation over the previous EKB model. It was in its modified form, it is much stronger in terms of both theory and concept. So, both the model is theoretically and conceptually stronger than the previous one. The number of constructs or components reduced from 5 to 4. The number of sub-constructs in each of the constructs have been increased, especially make reference of information processing. The manner in which the various sub-components of the decision process have been illustrated are also well appreciated, and the variables influencing decision process have been simplified as individual, social and situational influences. So, it is much more easier model to understand, to apply. Its model is theoretically and conceptually much stronger than the previous one. The model basically addresses how consumer decision may vary across different levels of decision making, and that while the decision making stages may remain the same, the amount of relative importance and time and the amount of focus that a consumer will basically spend on each of these stages would be based whether it is on high involvement or high perceived risk or a low involvement or a low perceived risk. So, the model basically assesses, makes a marketer understand that consumer decision making will vary across different levels of decision making, and while the various stages will remain the same, amount of effort, the amount of time, the focus that a consumer will put onto these stages will depend across high involvement and low involvement product categories. However, the model is not without limitations, and the major limitations that have been proposed are that again many of the constructs continue to be fuzzy, very unclear and vaguely defined. Also, the role and the impact and the manner in which these constructs affect each other or they affect the consumer decision process is debatable. The magnitude or the intensity or the strength of each of the variables impacting consumer decision process has not been studied, and that is where the weakness of the model lies. The basic constructs of the model which have been used, they proved to be poor, they proved to be weak, and that affects the reliability, the validity and the overall robustness of the model. So, that is how this particular model has been criticized. Nevertheless, it contributes significantly to the field of consumer behavior and to the study on the various models of consumer behavior. The part that we should appreciate is that EKB have been initially they proposed the model in 68, they went through a lot of revisions, lot of modifications. They kept testing the product, they kept testing the model across different products, across different service categories, across different purchase situations, and a lot of improvisations have been made. So in that sense, the model is something which is very lively in nature, but nevertheless it lacks the robustness, or it lacks strength where we can actually draw valid generalizations, or define the robustness of the model. So this is there are certain problems with respect to the model. Now let us come to the second model, which is the Bettmans information processing model of consumer choice. Now this particular model was proposed by Bettman in 1970s, and Bettman basically introduced that consumer behavior basically bases itself on information processing that takes place within the consumer. So what he did was, he was basically focusing on information processing and the manner of information processing, or the way in which information processing takes place within a consumer. That's why his model came to be known as the information processing model. Now according to this particular model, the consumer is basically is central to a host of information processing activities. A lot of activities happen, and information processing is one of the activities which goes on in the minds of the consumer. The consumer is basically central to a host of information processing activities related to everything. The consumer, he receives information from the environment externally, from the market, about the marketer, about the competitor, about the environment. So in this way he relies on external source of information and gathers a lot of information externally. Now this information goes and gets added to the body of knowledge, or the information stored already in his memory. So there is already a database, or there is already a storehouse of memory within him, which is the internal source. So whatever sources of information, whatever information which he gathers from external sources goes and gets added on into this database, into this internal source of information. So while he receives a large amount of information externally from the market, about the marketer, about the competitor, and about the environment, he also has a large store of information within him as a database that he has been developing over time, either from his learning, or from his experiences, or from social influences, etc. So with this huge amount of information which he has, information processing often becomes unmanageable, and it becomes very, very difficult. So what Bettman was trying to focus was that consumers are exposed to a large amount of stimuli, they are exposed to large amount of information cues. Much of these information cues come from the external sources, either as learning experiences, or as reading experiences, or as self experiences, or as other people's experiences, and all of this gets stored in the internal source, or in our memory. So we have on one hand cues which come from external sources, which get added up to, modified, or adapted to already existing internal source of information, or internal knowledge base, or internal knowledge database which we have. And so the consumer basically has a lot of information to deal with, and with this huge exposure to the amount of information that is exposed, the information processing often becomes difficult and unmanageable. So what Bettman was assuming was that consumers basically possess a limited capacity to process information, and when they are exposed to so much of information, they basically use certain simplifying strategies to process information. So the consumer information process can be depicted through a variety of or through several flow charts, which basically show or illustrate the various components of the model and the interrelationship between them. So if you look here, we start with the assumption that consumers have limited ability to process information. They have a lot of they're exposed to a lot of stimuli or information cues externally. They also have a database within them in the form of their memory, which they add to or modify from time to time depending upon the information cues that they receive. Because the consumers have a limited ability to process information, they use certain simplifying strategies, and we can here show the various flow charts which will depict the relationship between different constructs and show the interrelationship between them. Now, the various components of the model are, we start with, they are 6 in number. We start with the processing capacity, we then have motivation, we have attention, we have information acquisition and evaluation, there is decision process, and there is consumption and learning processes. So, these are the 6 major components of the model. There is processing capacity, the motivation, attention, information acquisition and evaluation, decision process, and consumption and learning processes. So, let us now explain the relationship between these components in the form of this model. Now, as we just said, when talking about processing capacity, Bettmans assumed that while information processing capacity varies across people, it is limited for each one of us. Consumers are not often interested in extensive information processing, and they always tend to look for certain strategies that make product selection an easy choice or an easy process. They often try to bypass their limits or by being selective towards information receptivity, ignoring certain kinds of information cues which they consider to be either irrelevant to them or incomprehensible. So, in other ways, they basically prioritize information that is required and is in use. So, the marketer here needs to understand the information processing capacity of his target segment or of his individual consumers while delivering marketing information. Not too much of information, not too much of technical information, not too much of technical jargon will work. What has to work is something which has to pertain to the consumer's need and motivation. It has to basically pertain to his levels of comprehension, retention and retrieval. So, this basically provides valuable insights into a marketer for design of his marketing communication strategy. So, we start here, we speak about the processing capacity. I repeat, it is something which is limited for each one of us. The consumers are not very often interested in extensive information search. They try to look in for procedures, they try to look in for strategies, they try to look in for methods which can basically simplify this information processing and information making product selection or making product choice an easy one. So, they often are very selective about the stimuli or about the information cue that they are exposed to, and anything which they consider irrelevant or any information cue which they feel is irrelevant to their needs or is something which is vague or difficult to understand or very technical to understand, or in other words anything which is incomprehensible clearly bypasses their attention, and they would basically look for such kinds of information which is more relevant to their need and which is more easy to understand and comprehend. So, here the marketer has to understand what the processing capacity of his people is and how he should be providing information which is more relevant to them and more easy for them to understand. This leads to the second component, which is motivation. Okay, now decision making choice within a consumer is provided strength, intensity and direction through motivation. Okay, so there always exists a hierarchy of goals or that provides different sub goals to simplify the choice process. Depending upon the priority of goals or depending upon the goal hierarchy, this component acts as a powerful and a very highly imposing component that controls directly not only the subsequent processes, but also controls indirectly the various sub processes in the model via the main process components. So, the continuation and suspension of various processes and sub processes and their interrelationship with the main processes are all impacted by motivation. This component also converts the non-action or passive input within the consumers into an action output or an active behavior. So, whatever strength, intensity and direction that the consumer is provided with respect to the cues or with respect to the stimuli that he is going to give attention to comes through motivation, and depending upon the priority of goals, this particular component, motivation as a component, acts as a powerful and imposing construct that controls not only directly the subsequent processes, but also controls indirectly the various sub processes of the model. And the continuation and suspension of many of these processes and sub processes and the interrelationship between them will all be impacted by motivation. Now we come to the third stage, which is attention and perceptual coding. Now attention could be voluntary as well as involuntary in nature. When a consumer actively searches for information, when he actively consciously seeks attention to achieve his goal, it is called a voluntary attention. Non-voluntary or involuntary attention is something which is very short term, that he provides before deciding whether he should process information that he has been exposed to and whether he should provide a voluntary attention. So when a consumer actively consciously seeks attention to achieve his goals, it is called a voluntary attention, and involuntary attention is the short term attention that he provides before deciding whether he should process the information that he has been exposed to and as to whether he should provide a voluntary attention. So non-voluntary attention can also happen when consumer is exposed to contradictory or conflicting information about products and needs to resolve between this conflicting information. So attention here can be voluntary as well as involuntary, and depending upon whether he actively seeks information attention or he gives it a thought whether to decide whether he should actually process information, we will differentiate them as voluntary and non-voluntary information. Perceptual encoding also occurs when in this particular stage, when a person integrates the information that he is processing into his already existing perceptual network or database. So when a person adds up more of information or cues to the existing database or to the existing perceptual base that he has, we call it perceptual encoding. Perceptual encoding and the database, based on this, the consumer will decide on the quantum of information or on the need for information that he needs to process. This leads to what we call as scanner and interrupt mechanisms and the resultant responses. Now, what is the scanner and interrupt mechanism? Now, the scanner and interrupt mechanism basically acts as a switch on and switch off for a consumer. Okay, so it is essentially a switch on off or a switch off mode. When the consumer realizes that he does not have enough information in his database, when he realizes that he does not have much information in his memory or in his perceptual database, he actively searches for information. He basically searches, gives attention to and becomes receptive to more and more of information from outside. On the other hand, if he feels that he has sufficient amount of information, the information gets interrupted. So the scanner and the interrupt mechanism basically impact the attention stage as well as the information acquisition stage, if we see the decision process stage and the consumption and learning processes. So out of the 6 components which form a part of this model, 4 which is attention, information acquisition and evaluation, decision process and consumption and learning processes, each of these is impacted by scanner and interrupt mechanisms. Now, as I repeat, these mechanisms here act as a switch on or a switch off mode. When for each of the stages, we will see that when a consumer realizes that he has enough information in his database, he does not have to search for more information, the interrupt mechanism occurs. On the other hand, when he realizes that or understands that he needs more information and he has to look around to external sources for more information, the scanner mechanism switches on, and the consumer basically scans the environment and looks for more information to put into his perceptual database. So when we speak about attention, we say that how much of attention he will give to will depend upon how much of information he already has. In case he has, the interrupt mechanism would be stronger. In case he does not have more information, he has to look for more information. He is more attentive to stimuli, he is more attentive to information search, and the will scan the environment for more of information. Then we come to the third component, the fourth component of the model, which is information acquisition and evaluation. Now, this consumer here decides on the kind of information as well as the quantum of information which will be required to make a choice decision. If he has the necessary information, he goes ahead with the next stage. In case he does not, he will look for external stage. Again, here, as I said earlier, the switch on and switch off mechanism will work, and the scanner and interrupt mechanisms go into play. After acquiring information, he will evaluate the information for utility, for sufficiency, and will go into the decision process stage. So, as we all know, in the decision process stage, the consumer takes a final call, he takes a final decision. This final decision is based not only on the acquired and evaluated information, but also his personal characteristics like demographics, psychographics, also social influences and situational factors. This stage again is impacted by scanner and interrupt mechanism. If the purchase is a routine purchase, decision making is faster, it is more often a repeat order. In case it is not, then it may take some time. Finally, we have the consumption and learning processes. After the consumer buys a particular product or buys a brand, his experience in terms of satisfaction or dissatisfaction gets stored in his memory. The learning affects subsequent decision making for similar product categories and affects the future heuristics for consumer decision making. It provides the consumers with information to be applied to similar choice situation in the future. This again is impacted by scanner and learning mechanisms. So, if we say that consumer decision making is something which is a complex process. Information processing capacity is limited. Consumers often rely on external and internal sources of information, but they always try to go looking for strategies, looking for methods that can simplify the decision process. They always look for mechanisms where they would have to look put in lesser and lesser amount of effort to search for information elsewhere. They rely on their perceptual database, they rely on their learning, they rely on their experiences, and based on their motives, based on the amount of the strength and intensity of the motive, they go into stages of attention or receptivity to information and stimuli. They go in for information acquisition and evaluation. They go in for a decision process, and finally go in for consumer learning and they go in for consumption and learning processes. Now, processing capacity, if we discuss the working relationship, processing capacity in an individual affects the motivation, attention, information acquisition and evaluation, decision process, consumption, learning processes. These processes impact and are impacted by various sub-processes. All these sub-processes impact the processes directly and indirectly and are also impacted by them, and various information processing capacity impacts and is impacted by the various processes and sub-processes directly and indirectly. Now, if we go in for an assessment of the model, the model is something which relies essentially on the information processing. So, in that way it is very narrow, it is very parochial. It starts with motivation, it starts with the motivation to search for more information, be attentive to information. Now, here when we speak about motivation to search for information, this motivation basically gives strength, direction and intensity to search for more information, and this will basically be based on the priority of goals or the hierarchy of goals or the needs or prioritization of needs which are more relevant to a consumer at a particular point of time. So, basically we start with information processing capacity, and then we have motivation to search for more information if the information queue is more relevant to us or is more pertinent to our need in question. Consumer is attentive to information, acquires information, takes a decision, and finally this the outcome of the decision in the form of good and bad experiences goes and gets stored in his memory as a part of his perceptual database for further use. The limitations of the model are that the model is too narrow, too parochial. It just confines itself to attend to information processing, and it is difficult to implement the model in practical scenarios. This completes our discussion on the various models of consumer decision making. Now, let us move to some short questions and some quiz that you could take for yourself, but before that a quick look at the references. So, we have Howard and Shate, The Theory of Buyer Behavior, John Wiley, Kotler and Armstrong, Principles of Marketing, 11th edition, Prentice Hall, 2006, Kotler and Keller, Marketing Management, 13th edition, Pearson, 2009, Loudon and Della Bitta, Consumer Behavior, 4th edition, 2002, Tata McGraw-Hill, Nicosia, Consumer Behavior Towards Sociology of Consumption, Journal of Consumer Research, Peter and Olson, Consumer Behavior and Marketing Strategy, McGraw-Hill, Schiffman and Canuck, Consumer Behavior, 3rd edition, Prentice Hall, Schiffman and Canuck, Consumer Behavior, 8th edition, Prentice Hall, and Wells and Prensky, Consumer Behavior, 1996, John Wiley. Short questions, frequently asked questions. Question number 1, critically assess Bettmans model of consumer behavior. So, you will first discuss the model, you will start with the assumptions of the model, you will explain, you will illustrate the model, define the various constructs or various components of the model, make an assessment of the model, and finally talk about the relevance in the context. Second question, explain the EKB model. What was the improvisation that led to the EKM model? So, you start with you start with the EKB model, and then you move on to the EBM model. You start with what is the EKB model, explain the model, illustrate the relationships, and then you move to the EKB model, or how was it improvised. Coming to a short quiz, question number section A, question number 1, true false. The Bettmans model comprises 5 parts: information, input, information processing, decision process stage, decision process variables, and external influences. So, is this true or is it false? Well, this is false. This particular model is not a Bettmans model, but it is the EKB model, or the Engel, Collat and Blackwell model. Question number 2, the EKB model consists of 4 sections. Again, this is false. The EKB model consists of 5 sections. We move to the next question, which is fill in the blanks. Question number 1, Bettmans model is a model that focuses only on dash. So, the answer is it focuses only on information processing. Question number 2, dash as a construct was additionally added as a modification over the EKB model. So, divestment as a construct was additionally added as a modification over the EKB model. Coming to short answers, mention the main components of Bettmans model. So, the main components of Bettmans model are processing capacity, motivation, attention, information acquisition and evaluation, decision process, consumption and learning processes. Question number 2, the EBM model consists of 4 distinct parts, name them. So, the 4 parts are input, information processing, decision process and variables influencing the decision process. With this, we come to the conclusion of module 5, and we have spoken about the models of consumers and the models of consumer behavior. We shall start with the next module, which is module 6, where we will speak about consumer psychographics from the next session onwards. I hope you have benefited from this session. Thank you.